Hello and welcome back to Survey of Human Anatomy and Physiology. This is Mrs. Popplewell, and today we're going to look at the skeletal system, Chapter 7. The skeletal system is composed of bones and parts which bind the bones together. We will look at tendons which bind muscle to bones, ligaments which bind bones to bones. If the joint that is formed by binding the bone to bone by these ligaments is a joint that holds a lot of body weight or has free range of motion in all directions, it's going to have many more ligaments than other joints. Cartilage, hyaline cartilage in particular, is the precursor to or the blueprint for most bones in your body, and is found at the end of long bones that articulate with one another. So it's found on the end of bones that form a joint. Bone functions for protection. It gives shape to the body. It supports the body weight. It protects the organs. You have storage of inorganic salts. The most important inorganic salt stored is calcium phosphate. You need calcium for blood clotting, nerve impulses, muscle contractions, and many other metabolic processes. So your body stores calcium in the bone, calcium phosphate. Other inorganic salts that are needed by the body that are stored in the bone are phosphates, magnesium, sodium, potassium. Hematopoiesis is blood cell formation. It occurs in red marrow, so red marrow that's found at the end of long bones and at different other parts of the body, in spongy bones and other parts of the body, are responsible for the formation of blood cells. The bones, muscles work together as the bones as levers, and the muscles work with these levers to aid in body movement. Let's talk about those levers now. There are 4 different components with levers, the way the bones work with the muscles at the joints to move something. You have a rigid bar, and that would be the bones. You have a pivot or fulcrum, that's where the bones join, or the joints is a pivot or fulcrum, which the bone turns. You have an object that you want to move. It offers the resistance. And then the force supplies the energy for the movement, which would be the muscles. The examples at the bottom of the slide here is the first class lever. You have the resistance, the fulcrum, and the force. The resistance would be the object being moved. The fulcrum would be the joint, and the force is applied by the muscle. And here the scissors are an example where you have resistance, the fulcrum, and the force. And in this instance, the resistance and the force are going to move in opposite directions with the joint in the middle. That would be a first-class lever. A second-class lever would have the fulcrum, the resistance, and the force. Here we have the resistance and the force moving in the same direction, with the starting out with the joint and then the resistance and then the force. Third class would be the resistance and the force with the fulcrum here, or the object being moved, the force being applied on the same side, and the joint or fulcrum. Now here we have, this is the biceps brachii that is found anterior muscle of the upper arm, is attached to the radius here. Okay, so here we have our fulcrum, here we have our force, and there is the resistance. The movement of your arm or other bones of your body happens with the action of levers. As the lower arm here bends, the forearm becomes the bar, The elbow joint is the pivot, and the hand has the weight in it. It is moved due to the actions of the anterior biceps brachii. So this is an example of a third-class lever. A third-class lever where you have the resistance and the force. On this, here's the force right here, and here's the resistance. So they're on the resistance is this way. So they're acting in the same direction. And here is the fulcrum. So it's fulcrum, act the force and the resistance on the same side. So this is classified as a third-class lever. Now the opposite motion is with the hand going downward, or extension of that forearm with the resistance against it. It will happen due to the movement of the triceps brachii, controlled movement of the biceps brachii. So you have the attachment here, and you have the fulcrum, and there is the resistance. The lower arm straightens the forearm. The bone again serves as the bones of the lower arm serves as a rigid bar. The hand has the weight. The elbow is the joint. So you have the pivot, and the weight is moved in different directions. So that gives you a first-class lever using the triceps brachii. Okay, let's look at the classification of bones. We talked about this a bit in lab, or we will talk about this in lab if you haven't gone through your lab yet. Long bones are usually longer than they are wide. Here's a femur. Look at the length of that long bone. Long bones are longer than they are wide. Now, you have to be careful here because the phalanges, which are the finger bones and the toe bones, are also long bones. And when you get to the little toe, that distal phalanx and that middle phalanx are awfully small, but they're still longer than they are wide, so they are called long bones. Short bones are found in the wrist. They're cube-shaped, and a few in the ankle. Flat bones, the majority of the bones of the skull are flat bones, also the ribs, the shoulder blade, which is called the scapula, the sternum are all flat bones. Most of the bones of the skull are flat bones. Irregular bones, yes, they have an irregular shape. Vertebrae are irregular bones, and some of the facial bones are irregular bones. Most bones of the skull are flat, but those that make up the face are irregular, most of them. Sesamoid bone are also called round bones. They're embedded within tendons and ligaments. This is the patella, the kneecap, that is a sesamoid bone, but you also find sesamoid bones at the base of the thumb and the base of the big toe. The parts of the long bone, the epiphysi are the ends of the bones, epiphysis. Some pronounce it as epiphysis, and I learned it as epiphysis, so I'm going to say epiphysis, and epiphysi would be plural. And we have to use our directional terms here. The proximal, remember, is closest to the trunk of the body as compared to a distance away. So this is the proximal epiphysis, and then this is the distal epiphysis. The diaphysis is in between the epiphysi. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. The bone is made up of compact bone. Compact bone is found here. And spongy bone looks just like its name. This is spongy bone. Spongy bone is where you would find red marrow. Okay, at the ends of the bone, and the epiphysi is spongy bone, then there would be red marrow, and remember red marrow, hematopoiesis, the formation of blood cells. All right, so compact bone is this outer layer covered by the periosteum, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then there's spongy bone and the medullary cavity. The cavity has just a little bit of spongy bone, but in the medullary cavity in an adult you will have yellow marrow. We'll talk about that again in just a minute. On the proximal and distal epiphysis, we have articular cartilage where that bone articulates or moves, forms a joint with another bone. So on this surface of the head of the femur here, we have articular cartilage. It stops about right there and about right there, just the part that articulates with the coxa, the acetabulum of the coxa, or in that hip, the depression in that hip bone. Just the part that articulates with that would have the articular cartilage. Just this part of the femur that articulates with the tibia would have articular cartilage. Periosteum, it is a dense connective tissue found on the outside of bones. Medullary cavity, if you ever eat chicken and you've ever broken apart that leg bone of the chicken leg, you see usually cooked marrow in there. That is the medullary cavity. In adults, it would be yellow marrow. In a young child would have red marrow in the medullary cavity. Remember, yellow marrow is an area where adipose tissue is stored, and that would be in the medullary cavity of long bones in adults. Okay, red marrow, hematopoiesis, the formation of red blood cells. Yellow marrow are all blood cells. Yellow marrow, storage of adipose tissue. Here's another picture and where we can see the compact bone. Here's the compact bone. This is a cross-section of the diaphysis of a long bone. And there's the compact bone and the medullary cavity. Now the medullary cavity has a very little bit of spongy bone inside of it, and packed in that spongy bone would be the yellow marrow in an adult bone. Okay, now here is the spongy bone of the proximal epiphysis, and it looks very spongy here. It would have red marrow, so if you were asked on a lab practical or lab quiz what's found here, yes, it is spongy bone, but spongy bone would contain the red marrow for hematopoiesis. On the outside here you have a layer of compact bone, and then you would have periosteum here. Here we have the remnant of the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate, in that spongy bone. The microscopic structure of the compact bone. We saw this model, or you will see this model in lab, and let's go over the different parts. This raised area has these concentric circles. As this bone starts as hyaline cartilage, and as one layer of hyaline cartilage is ossified on top of another, these concentric circles are formed. The concentric circles all together, this one unit here is called the osteon. Another name, a person's name, the Haversian system, but osteon is fine. This center is a canal or an opening. It is sometimes called the osteonic canal or the central canal. Osteonic canal or the central canal. It contains blood vessels and nerves. Yes, you have this tissue is innervated, has nerves, and it is very vascular. A major break can cause a great amount of blood loss because there's major blood vessels running through the medullary cavities, and then more minor blood vessels running through the central canal, and then we have the perforating canals. So central canals, this is the long way of the bone. The central canal runs the length of the bone, and running the width of the bone would be the perforating canals. Central canal, blood vessels and nerves. The perforating canals, so those blood vessels can work together in those central canals. You have the perforating canals. Also, nerves would be passed through there also. Embedded in those plates of bone, inorganic salts, the non-living part of the bone is called the matrix. And in the non-living part of the bone is a depression or cavity that holds the living part of the bone, the osteocyte. So here's an osteocyte. There you can see a little nucleus of that osteocyte, and there are protoplasmic extensions out into what we call the canal iculus, and these are little grooves in that non-living matrix that these extensions can protrude into. And also here we have those little dots right there are osteocytes. Well, here's the blood supply. So the nutrients and getting rid of waste have to happen by a process of diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And that's what's happening from these blood vessels. The nutrients, the oxygen, and things that are needed by these living cells diffuse through the bone, through the canal iculus, to the living cell of that bone. So there are parts of the bone that are living, and that is the osteocytes. There's 3 different types of bone cells, but right now we're just going to look at the osteocyte. Let me go back here. All right, the osteocyte lays in this little canal, or lays in this little chamber, bony chamber, and that bony chamber is called the lacuna. The matrix is laid down in layers of lamellae, or lamella. That's each of those concentric circles is a lamella. As that precursor of bone is ossified one layer upon the other, and each layer is a lamella. Okay, canal iculus, again, are those little, it is a groove in that non-living matrix, in that bone, that allows for things to diffuse to that living cell. Those protoplasmic extensions come off of the osteocyte to make it look more like a spider or a tick or something. Those protoplasmic extensions extend into the canal iculi so that it can pick up all the nutrients and oxygen and things that are needed to live. Also, that is a living cell, so it's metabolically active, so it has to get rid of metabolic wastes. So it will get rid of the metabolic waste, again, by diffusion out through the canal iculus, those protoplasmic extensions. That's an extension off the cell membrane there. Of those is the protoplasmic extensions. okay, into the canal iculus. The osteocytes are not laid down along the central canals in the spongy bone. We're looking at spongy bone now. Now this is the compact bone. This area is spongy bone. And of course we had had spongy bone there, and in the proximal epiphysis, this is the distal epiphysis. Where you have spongy bone, you don't have osteons. Okay, so we have a cross section here. This is a longitudinal section, and this would be a cross. This would be a cross section. This would be a longitudinal section. Okay, we're looking at a cross section here. When we look at a cross section of that bone, we can see the osteons. In spongy bone, there are no osteons. The osteocytes are just laid into the trabeculae, or these little plates that make up the spongy bone. Trabeculae are these plates that make up the spongy bones, and the osteocytes are randomly placed in the trabeculae. There are no osteons. And again, all these, whether it's compact bone or spongy bone, the cells are nourished by diffusion, the movement of those molecules from those blood vessels, because you don't see blood vessels going directly to that living cell. They don't branch off and go to the living cells. Things happen because of diffusion. Cells are nourished by diffusion, and unwanted waste product is given off by diffusion.